Well, welcome to the academic lineage module. In this module, we're going to look at some of the ancients up until modern day, some of the people that have been involved in pushing forward the use of cannabis, both for medical reasons, and we'll look at some of the activists that have been a little more vocal, say in the last 10, 15 years, or even 30, 40 years. And so we'll just get a kind of a glimpse at some of this path that we've been on as far as the use of cannabis goes in more modern day times. So let's start with Pliny the Elder, and Pliny lived from 23 to 79 in the current era. He was a Roman scholar and an author, and in one of his books, the Natural History book 20, he noted that hemp was a remarkably useful plant for making rope. So of course we know that people had been making rope with hemp for centuries before that, and so we just sort of put that note in as like, hey, it's still working really well for making rope. Of course, rope was a pretty important tool back in those days. He also talked medicinally about the hemp plant or the cannabis plant. A decoction of the root in water relaxes contractions of the joints, and we presume he was talking about pain from arthritis. For that, cures gout and similar maladies. So that's kind of how he was using it, and so that kind of set the tone for some of the more modern day uses of this, at least recorded modern day uses of this product. And if we move forward a few centuries to Nicholas Culpeper, Nicholas Culpeper was a really interesting figure in our use of, our more modern use of plants as medicine, so herbal medicine. Culpeper was an English botanist. He was a herbalist, a physician, and an astrologer. A lot of times back then, astrology and medicine were quite intertwined. So Culpeper at one time was accused of being a witch because that was sort of during the era of witches, back in the time when if you used medicinal plants to cure someone, you were acting against God's will because God was the only one that would heal you according to some religious beliefs. And so anyone who was using medicinal plants back then often got labeled as being a witch, and some people actually lost their lives from that. But he was quite persistent. He felt that medicine should be accessible to all the people rather than having that gatekeeper of a physician. And of course, back then, physicians were charging excessive fees for their medicines. And so he thought, well, everyone should be able to look after their own health by using the plants that grow in their backyard. His book, The English Physician, which was published in 1652, and that was later renamed The Complete Herbal. Culpeper described hemp as an effective anti-inflammatory for easing colic, so that would be things like any kind of digestive upset, and as an anthelmintic, which is for deworming, for getting rid of sort of worms and parasites and those kinds of things. So Culpeper is a really important character of, if you study any kind of herbal medicine, you would definitely study the works of Culpeper from back sort of in those days when we were starting to document how plants were used as medicine. Next, we'll move on to William Brooke O'Shaughnessy. And O'Shaughnessy lived from 1809 to 1889. He lived a good long life. He was Irish. He was an Irish physician. And this man was really instrumental in setting up some of the medical procedures that we are using even today. So he started to pioneer these back in the 1800s. He pioneered intravenous therapy to treat cholera, and he also worked on, he sort of laid the groundwork for doing blood analysis and trying to figure out what was going on with people based on what was in their blood. During his career, he did a lot of early research into medical cannabis use because he went into Kolkata in India, where he began researching applications of cannabis, because in India they were using cannabis medicinally a lot more than what was happening over in the English world. And so he started studying that, and he was really the first Western physician to successfully relieve the pain of rheumatism and still the convulsions of an infant with cannabis. So using some of those cannabis plants and medicinal properties of cannabis with infants, and that just was unheard of in the Western world at that time. He was so impressed with what he was learning from the Indian culture, from the Indian medical system, that he brought that knowledge back to the Western world. And he's really credited with introducing the medicinal properties of the cannabis plant into sort of more modern day medicine as we see it today. So I think we can really hold O'Shaughnessy up as one of our pioneers of modern day cannabis medicine. So based on O'Shaughnessy's work, there was the Indian Hemp Drugs Commission that was based on some research that was conducted from August 1893 to 1894. And the commission interviewed about 2,000 witnesses, from medical officers to missionaries in 30 cities across India. And they really wanted to get an idea of, like, how is cannabis being used? Like, this mysterious plant, why is it so integrated into this Indian type of medicine, the Ayurvedic medicine? What were the effects of the hemp drug? Indians called it the ganja, on physical, mental, and moral well-being. And so it was a really interesting commission that they did. And some of that work that was done back then has been kind of brought forward to become sort of the basis of our medical system now for the use of cannabis. There were books, just as we have textbooks for physicians and doctors today. Those books started out maybe in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and they've been in continuous use. Of course, they get updated every couple of years or even once a year. The reference book for physicians in the up until the mid-1900s actually had a monograph for cannabis and how to use it medicinally. So we talked about how cannabis has been used by, your local family doctor in the villages and the towns back in the 1800s, early 1900s. And this book, their textbook, their reference book that they would refer to, does talk about cannabis being used as an analgesic, so that's as a painkiller, or to help manage pain, chronic pain, anti-seizure medication, for dysmenorrhea, so those are issues with a woman's menstrual cycle, whether it be pain or other issues that were going on there. Dysentery, so gastrointestinal problems, as well as maybe infections that would cause diarrhea, those types of things. And then it was also routinely used in veterinary medicine as well, specifically to dress wounds, to help stop infection from happening, to relieve pain, to ease digestive issues in animals as well. The veterinary use of cannabis is starting to pick up again as it has become legal. And so we're going to see a lot more products used in the veterinary area. And that isn't just kind of coming out of the blue. That was routinely used before, prior to prohibition. Along the same lines as the American book, we had the British one, which of course Canadian physicians would use the British Pharmaceutical Codex. And this was the 1911 edition. When it talks about cannabis, it says it acts chiefly on the central nervous system. It first produces excitement with hallucinations. Might be a bit of an exaggeration with that. A feeling of happiness and indifference to surroundings, and this stage is being followed by a deep sleep. So it's kind of showing in that little sentence, it talks about how it can be used to sort of bring joy to somebody, maybe relieve a little bit of depression, give them a little bit of energy, and then also help with relaxation and sleep as well. It is used as an anodyne sedative or hypnotic, so that's pain relieving, helping to induce sleep to help somebody get through some chronic pain. In mania, spasmodic coughs, ptosis, asthma, acute neuralgia, so that'd be any kind of neuropathic pain, and we know that it works very well for that. There's that dysmenorrhea coming up again, so any kind of issues with the menstrual cycle, specifically pain and cramping, and tetanus, so some infections as well it was used for. It does not produce constipation nor loss of appetite. So that's what this book talked about. And we actually know now that certain strains of cannabis can actually induce appetite, help people to have an appetite as well. So those were a couple of important books that actually physicians used, and cannabis was in those books, those medical books. Next, we move on to Roger Adams. Roger Adams is a little bit of a forgotten figure in the whole cannabis industry, but he was an American organic chemist, and he really should be given credit for discovering THC way back in the 1940s. He also identified and isolated cannabidiol, or CBD, which is another cannabinoid in the cannabis plant. And he identified CBN, or cannabinol, and that's another cannabinoid. So we now know there's well over 100 cannabinoids within the cannabis plant, but those were the first three that were kind of isolated, and that was way back in the 1940s that they started understanding that. Adams was the first to extract cannabinoids from the cannabis plant and do some experimenting with those. And he, along with his partner, Walter Lowe, were first to create the synthetic analogs of those three cannabinoids, CBN, CBD, and THC. So he really created the first synthetic versions of the cannabis plant that were used as medicine and are in use today, or at least a version of them are in use today. He was really a pioneer in cannabinoid extraction methods and early cannabis product manufacturing. A lot of his pioneer work in extraction methods are what some of the licensed producers are using a version of today, or an evolved version of that. But he really was the first to start to understand what constituents you could pull out of the cannabis plant based on different methods of extraction to give you different types of medicine to treat different health conditions. So Adam's partner, Walter Lowe, he was a German pharmacologist. He did immigrate to the USA in 1933, and he worked with Roger Adams. And as we said, they created the first synthetic analogs of CBD, CBN, and THC. And Lowe was the first to conduct CBD testing on lab animals, and he was the one that proved that CBD is non-psychoactive. It doesn't get you high or alter your state of consciousness at all the way THC does. So he was kind of the first one to prove through animal testing that there are some constituents in cannabis that are not psychoactive. And he also, once he sort of had proven that in animals, he started to do the first tests on humans with some of those cannabinoids isolated out from the cannabis plant. So Lowell and Adams actually laid the groundwork for Dr. Raphael Mechoulam, and Raphael Mechoulam really is credited with being the grandfather of medical cannabis. And so Mechoulam tends to get all of the glory. He is still alive today. He is retired, lives in Jerusalem, and he still does quite a few lectures, especially for universities around the world. If you wanted to catch up on Dr. Mechoulam's work, just go to plug his name into YouTube, and there are hours and hours and hours of his lecturing, mostly at universities, but sometimes at medical conferences, those kinds of things. Dr. Mechoulam really started to bring medical cannabis into the spotlight. He was well spoken, he was well respected. So Dr. Mechoulam and his family had moved to Jerusalem just to escape some of the ravages of the Second World War, what was happening there. And he was a young man then, was going to a university and was like, okay, what am I going to do with my life? And he wanted to study a plant and maybe something that nobody else had studied. So he decided he wanted to figure out why cannabis made people high. What was it in there? And of course, being illegal in most of the world at that time, he needed to find some raw material to work with. So he would go to the police, he would take the bus down to the police station, have a cup of coffee with them, and then he would say, like, could I have any of the cannabis product that you seized from people who had it illegally so that I could take it back to my lab and do experiments? And so he was given that product. He would take it on the bus back to his lab, and he would say, by the time I got back to my lab, everybody on the bus was happy because, of course, cannabis being a smelling plant, it would sort of smell up the whole bus and everybody would get relaxed from it. So he talks about this in his story in a documentary. Again, you can get it on YouTube. It's called The Scientist. And he talks about this and how he did all of his lab experiments. He and his wife did some social experiments as well. His wife would make a chocolate cake and lace it with some cannabis, and then they have a dinner party. And he observed how different people reacted to the cannabis when they were eating this chocolate cake. And he said how some people would fall asleep in the corner, and someone got really scared, and someone got super chatty, and a couple got like really amorous. And so he realized, like, this plant really reacts very differently in people, even though they were taking the same amount. And that made him really curious. So he's got a really interesting story to tell. And so go watch The Scientist on YouTube. It's well worth looking at. Anyways, they had isolated THC, which of course Adams and Lowell before him had already isolated THC, but he sort of took that to the next step. And he kind of reverse engineered and said, okay, if this is the substance that's making people high or giving that euphoric feeling or that feeling of impairment, then where's that reacting in the body? Like what is that mechanism? And so by kind of reverse engineering that, he went into the body and discovered what we now know of as the endocannabinoid system of the body. So this is a system in the body that will accept the constituents from the cannabis plant. Now, the body actually produces its own cannabinoids, and Dr. Mechoulam was kind of the first one to sort of recognize that that was going on. So really early research into the endocannabinoid system. He also very early on proved that CBD given to people with seizure disorders, it would manage the seizure disorders. And this was way back in the 60s and 70s. He discovered that. He tried to tell the world about it, and nobody would listen to him because, you know, this constituent came from a plant that was considered to be very dangerous. And so even to this day, feels so badly that he wasn't able to get the word out, millions of people with seizure disorders have needlessly suffered, where the remedy, or at least something to manage it, was right there within sight, but it was because of political pressure, it was withheld from the people. So, Dr. Mechoulam has really been not only a researcher, but an activist for saying, this is a legitimate medicine here, that people should be able to have access to it.